All right, welcome everybody to another Soil Health Nexus Digital Cafe. My name is Christine Charles. I'm based over in Michigan. I'm an extension educator with Michigan State. And I just want to remind folks what and who the Soil Health Nexus is. So, Soil Health Nexus is a university-led team dedicated to increasing access to research-based soil health knowledge, extension, and resources. We include representatives from all 12 North Central region states. If you are interested, and oopsies, I'm like skipping all over the place here. If you're interested in getting more involved in leadership, please let us know too. We have regular calls in addition to our webinars that we host. So just let us know. Okay. So to walk you through how today will work, we're going to have our presentation, our digital cafe highlight, our presenter, and then we will get into Q&A with our speaker. So you are welcome to unmute and ask your question. We can have an open dialogue. That way you can put your questions in the chat as well. And then for the last bit of our time together, we'll be going into breakout rooms by your profession or your area of expertise to discuss with your colleagues about the topic that was presented on today. So, without further ado, I'm going to be introducing Eric Brevik from Southern Illinois University, and he's going to be talking about soil and human health, its current status, and future needs. So excited to have you highlight this topic, Eric. It's something that I know I get a lot of questions on, so it's really great to have you here to talk to us about it.
Excited to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Absolutely. Okay, I'll stop sharing my screen and then I'll hand it over to you to share.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's talk. I guess um, the uh, the link between soils and human health are something that I have worked on for quite a few years now, and so definitely have a lot of interest in, and I'm excited to share those with you. But as we get going on this topic, the first thing I want to do is pose a question to the group. And that is, what do you think of when you think of human health? And I know it's a little bit of a biased question at the immediate moment because you've come to a talk on soils and human health. So you probably got soils right there at the front of your mind. But think back to, maybe like, 6 months or a year ago before you even, had an invitation to come and have this kind of a talk given to you, the kinds of things that would have come to mind for you. And I know that for me, for a lot of my life, even after I did my PhD in soil science for a while, soils are not one of the things that would have popped right up for me as, one of those things with human health. I would think about things, like, good food, healthy diet, are something that come to mind for me. Getting adequate exercise, doing your preventative medicine, getting your, medical care done when you need it. These are the kinds of things that for me would have come to mind. And, we don't really have a fantastic grasp, on how many people actually do think of soil. It's one of those projects I'd like to work on one day that you never quite get around to, right? Is polling the public to figure out what they think about when they think of human health and how many people actually bring up soil. But my expectation is that probably a lot of people, soil would not be one of those first three or four things that would come to mind when someone comes up and says, "What's important to you with your health?" And yet, we do know that it is. And this is a soil health forum, and obviously, you look at the diagram here, and we have healthy soils. Those soils are better able to support the growth of healthy plants. Those healthy plants better pass along nutrients to humans. There's a lot of other things. I won't talk about everything in the talk right now on this first slide, but there's very definitely links between our soil and our health, and that's not something I think most people have pop right to the forefront when they're thinking about it all. The links, actually, the recognition that there is a link between soils and health is probably actually it is quite ancient. We here you can read in Numbers in the Bible. This is something from about 1400 BC, where Moses is giving instructions to his scouts who are going to go into Canaan, and he tells them, among other things, how is the soil? Is it fertile or poor? Are there trees or not? Bring back some fruit of the land. There's this realization that that soil is really important to the well-being of the people that they're taking into this area. We got Hippocrates. This is the Hippocratic Oath, right? The father of modern medicine. And back in 400 BC, he put together a list of things that should be included by a physician in any good, complete medical evaluation. And when you read his list, you get to a point in that list where it includes the ground. He talks about the ground and whether it's naked and deficient of water or it's wooded and well watered. Whether it lies in a hollow, confined situation, or is elevated and cold, that second part of the statement might be more of a landscape issue, but the first part, and you always have to be very careful when working with history not to obviously interpret things from a different perspective than the person who was making these statements in the time. But the way that he talks about the ground being naked and deficient in water or wooded and well watered, I think that at least to some extent, he's describing that superficial layer that in today's world we would term as a soil when he talks about his medical evaluation. A little more recently, you move into the 1900s, so within the last 100 years or so, but 1938 was a really big year for soil science in the United States of America. That was the publication of a USDA Yearbook of Agriculture that was focused completely on soils. You read through that entire volume. It's like 800 and whatever or something, pages. It's a really thick tome. Um, but within that, it's gotten a lot of attention over the years for the introduction of what we call the 1938 soil classification system, which is a really big deal, especially to the pedological side of the soil science world. But if you read the whole thing, you'll find there's at least 3 chapters within there that deal with soil human health connections. In 1940, someone Waxman's research group at Rutgers University, they isolated antibiotic compounds from soil organisms for the first time. That actually got Waxman the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine later in his career, which is kind of amazing that there's a soil scientist out there, or there was a soil scientist. He's no longer with us, of course, but that there was a soil scientist with a Nobel Prize in Medicine. That's kind of mind blowing to me. And we also see in the 1957 Yearbook of Agriculture, that was another one devoted to soils. And in that one, we see where our federal soil scientists are really starting to recognize and to put out there in their publications that beyond the nutrient supply aspect, we're starting to really recognize the toxic side, where we can end up with toxins building up in a soil and causing problems for human health and in the human diet. It's not, got to make sure I keep flipping these forward, I suppose. I got my 2 screens up and I got one screen in front of me that I can see the slides without the flips. So moving on, it's not just the government. We in the 1940s, we also had a publication from the International Harvester Company. So we have the agricultural industry within the nation out there also publishing things about soil. And there's a statement from this Make Soil Productive publication that refers to poor soils producing stoop-shouldered, poverty-stricken people. Basically, if you don't have good soil, you're not going to be healthy. Is being communicated within this publication. It's not just the U.S. In 1943, Lady Eve Balfour published The Living Soil, a rather famous work in the world of soil science. Shortly thereafter, Sir Albert Howard published his landmark work on soil and health, study of organic agriculture. Both Lady Eve Balfour, Sir Albert Howard are really important figures in the history of organic agriculture, but both also devoted extensive portions of their works to look to discussing links between soil and human health issues. And in France, we have André Vasson, who published Soil, Grass, and Cancer a few years later. So, the title of Vasson's work obviously very definitely brings across a health connection in the sense of having cancer in the title, right? There's a health connection there. So um, so anyway, by the end of the 1900s, Margaret Oliver, she published a review paper on soils and human health right there in the 1900s. Went through a lot of these things we've been talking about at this point in time, and she came to the conclusion that you know there was a lot of antecedent evidence, a lot of speculation about links between soils and human health. There wasn't a lot of really firm scientific documentation. Now, what I want you to get out of this brief introduction to the history here is that the idea of connections between soils and human health, this is not a new idea. This goes back, thousands of years actually. When you look at some of the very early things, the biblical accounts or the Hippocrates, there's a very long history of recognition that soils and human health have a connection. However, what is actually very new is the scientific study of soils and human health. We do have some groups out there that are focused on this. A great example, USDA has a lab over, it's on the Cornell University campus in New York. And that lab is focused. It was created. I think it was 1950s, if I remember right. It was created expressly to look at these soil-human health relationships. And there's other positions and other people out there that are working on this as well. But a lot of what's out there, certainly as we came to the to about 20, 30 years ago, a lot of what was out there was not strongly scientifically documented. So we have a real need for rigorous, well-designed scientific studies that look at these connections. So, with that established, what kinds of things have we spent a lot of our time, looking at, in these connections? And probably the most frequently investigated is the transfer of nutrients from soil to people through the food that we eat. And that food can be crops that were grown in the soil, so it's kind of a somewhat direct transfer. It can be a transfer from forages to animals to people. It could be a little bit more of an indirect transfer. But there is a lot of work out there looking at that. Again, I mentioned I forget the name of the lab off the top of my head, but the lab at Cornell that is focused on this, this is where a lot of their work has gone. As we got into the 1970s, 80s, and started to become a lot more concerned about environmental issues and the status of our environment, we started to see a lot of work done looking at the exposure of toxic levels of pollutants, and that included exposures through the soil. The map right here is actually from a project one of my graduate students is working on right now. He's hopefully be finished up in the next semester here. But here we've got a map showing the distribution of zinc around his study site. It's mapped out using the contamination factor. And contamination factor is very simply, it's looking at the relationship between the amount of zinc that we found when we analyzed samples at the site compared to the expected, natural background levels that we would encounter for zinc. You can see that across much of the site, zinc's not a problem. Those greens, the dark green is where zinc is less than 1. So it means we actually have uh, a little less zinc than we would expect naturally there, but it means contamination is not a problem, or at least as you interpret the contamination factor, that's what it interprets. The light green, we're a little bit above natural levels, but not to an extent that really is seen as being concerning. But you can see that down here in the lower portion of the study site off here on the sidebar, we do have some areas that get up into the reds. And so with that red, those are places where the zinc concentrations are more than 6 times our expected natural background. And that's indicating, in this case, that we expect, we got probably very high contamination. Of zinc. We've had human activities that have concentrated zinc in that location, and it's a place where we might start to worry about human health concerns through the soil zinc relationships in that location. This site, I should probably mention, is a brownfield site. It is being considered at the moment. It's a piece of property that Southern Illinois University owns. It's being considered for some agrivoltaics research work. But before we go out and start growing crops at the site, it was felt that it was a good idea to actually know what the soil situation was here, because it is a brown field. It has had development in the past, and there's not a guarantee that the soils are clean. And so this is part of Chase's work is his work is doing the analysis out there to look at this and whether the site's good for that kind of use. Um, Soil considerations being very important here. A lot of work also has been done, especially recently, looking at the exposure to various soil organisms that might cause problems for human health. There are lots of ways this can happen, from being exposed to viruses and bacteria, all the way up to things like tapeworm or hookworms. There are a lot of things that live in the soil that can cause a problem for humans. Now, if we have a healthy soil situation, a healthy soil ecosystem, these things cause problems for us tend to be of less concern. They're kind of crowded out by other things that aren't a problem for us. Lots of soil organisms are very beneficial to us, but not all. And so the pathogens have received quite a bit of interest. Um, the connections between soil and water. Soil and water are part of a continuum within our environment. And so the ways that things are transferred from soil to water or vice versa, and what that means for our health, have been in our area of large study. One of the big things with this, the things we looked at with this, nitrate concentrations in water have been a big one. If we have nitrate concentrations are too high, that's been linked to things like stomach cancers, blue baby syndrome, where the nitrates can actually take up sites on the red blood cells that normally would be held by oxygen to transfer oxygen through the body. And so high nitrate levels in water through the loss of nitrogen fertilizers out of our soils. That's a big concern. And in many of our big corn producing states, for example, we see very high levels of nitrates in the water systems, because of all the fertilizers that have been used over the years. We have geophagy has been a really big topic, especially amongst the anthropologists that get involved in this topic. Geophagy is the deliberate consumption of soil. There are a number of benefits that the advocates for geophagy promote with this practice: vitamin and mineral supplementation, things like that. But there's also a number of potential health risks that go along with this. Plugged up systems has been a problem for people that practice geophagy, and also exposure to pathogens. If you have high cation exchange capacity clays, they have caused nutritional problems, as the clays have absorbed cations from the digestive system as they pass through it, and end up leading to nutrient deficiencies. So there's both good and bad possibilities have been documented with geophagy. Medicines from soil are a really big one. In fact, a lot of people don't realize that approximately 40% of all commonly used prescription drugs have soil origins, and for antibiotics, that percentage is much higher. So if you've ever gone to the doctor, been prescribed an antibiotic, you probably have had your problem cured through a medication that has a soil origin of some sort. This is back to Selman Waxman and his lab having that first antibiotic isolation for soil organisms back in 1940. Um, that's not an isolated incident. That is something that has continued, and pharmaceutical companies spend a lot of time looking for new compounds in soil. And then just soil conservation, food security issues. We know, get the picture here of a field. The top of the hill, you can see how light the soil is. Top of that hill, the A horizon has been stripped off, in this case due to erosion. And notice that the young corn plants in that picture aren't doing so well. Up there on the top of the hill, there simply isn't enough nutrient status left in those hilltop soils to produce a good crop. And what does grow up there on the top of that hill is probably going to be deficient in the nutrients required to, pass them along for, human health aspects if this corn is to be consumed by humans or by animals that will then be consumed by humans. So, soil conservation actually is a major part of ensuring food security, and both of these are a major part of ensuring human health. So, and then most frequently, is probably the newest of the common research trends I'm going to discuss today involving soils and human health, but the integrated systems approach to soils and human health. And this is a category into which I group things like the soil health, human health nexus, where we look at human health from the perspective of healthy soils, and then the things those healthy soils are able to provide to us, which support human health. The One Health movement is another one that I put into this integrated systems approach, and of course, One Health looks at animal health, human health, and environmental health as all being interlinked, which they are. I say they look at it, but don't get the impression I don't think that's the case. But they really promote that interconnected aspect where if we're doing things that are good for human health and environmental health and animal health, all of it ties together and feeds back. The ecosystem services approach and looking at how ecosystem services support human health. That's also very much one of these, what I might classify as one of these integrated systems approaches to looking at the human health, soil health world. Uh, with all of these, the concern becomes much bigger than an isolated study where we're looking at, soil to plant to human transfer of nutrients or exposure to pathogens or toxins, things like that. These are much more system oriented approaches to looking at the big question of soils and human health. And while we do as scientists, we need to bite off chunks that are small enough for us to chew, and you can't always look at everything. You can't like always run a study on the systems level. I think viewing these things from that systems level and trying to understand where your study fits into it and how it adds to a systems understanding can be a really important aspect of making sure what you're doing is really addressing things that'll move us forward as we go into the future. So, what kinds of things do we need to know that we don't have a very good grasp on right now? As we look at future needs in soils and human health. Well, one of the very biggest ones, in my opinion, is understanding the interactive relationships between the various things that we find in the environment that influence our health um, and what our health ends up being. And a great example of this is the itty itty disease. This is something, the first symptoms of iti in Japan appeared back in the 1910s. By the 1970s, uh, the Japanese government actually recognized iti as a problem, and a problem that was caused due to soil contamination relationships. Iti in Japanese, that literally means it hurts, it hurts. It's an extremely painful condition, causes pain within the bones, very brittle bones, weakness of the bones, renal failure. The individual in the picture here is an unfortunate victim, of this, and notice that there's a complete lack of ability for them to straighten up due to bone deterioration. In this case, the eventually in the 1960s and 70s, there were scientists and medical professionals who were advocating this long before the 60s and 70s. But in the 60s and 70s, the Japanese government finally conceded that iti was being caused within the Toyama prefecture of Japan because of the release of industrial wastewaters from mining and processing operation upstream from Tacoma City. That those operations were releasing cadmium into the local river, and then water from that river was being used to irrigate rice paddies. The cadmium was building up in soils, being taken up by the rice plants, and from that passed through the food system and on to humans living within this area. You see here we had in this area of Japan, the cadmium levels in the soils were reaching 1 to 3 milligrams per kilogram in the paddies that were being irrigated with this cadmium. Now, so you say, okay, so this is a nice historical example of a problem caused by a metal in soil, but how does this lead to understanding interactive relationships? Well, if you go to Shipham, England, another mining community, they have soils that are frequently above 10 milligrams per kilogram of cadmium. In some cases, it's been documented as high as about 800 milligrams per kilogram in some isolated locations. Yet we don't see any of the health challenges amongst the people in Shipham that we saw in Japan. Um, Now, there's really no doubt amongst those that have done the work here that cadmium is the culprit in the Japanese health problems. So, what's going on with England? A number of different hypotheses have been advanced. One of those is diet. Basically, the English diet is much more diverse than the Japanese diet in the area. The Japanese diet was very rice centered, and the cadmium was in the rice paddies, whereas the diet in Shipham is a much more diverse diet. And so it might just be that, because of the diversity of food sources, no one food source is taking up the cadmium in levels that are causing challenges for the Shipham population. Another set of hypotheses revolves around the soil conditions, soil pH, soil aeration status, these kinds of things. But due to pH levels, due to aeration, perhaps cadmium is more mobile within the Japanese soils and within the English soils. A big thing that's been pushed by several people have been zinc and iron interactions. Where that comes in is that the more diverse English diet is much richer in zinc and iron than the Japanese rice-based diet was, and it's known that zinc and iron can buffer against cadmium retention in the human body. And so it might be that it was back to the food, but it might be that the iron and zinc levels in the food source of the English inhabitants around Shipham is providing a level of protection against cadmium accumulation in their bodies, and then the health benefits or health challenges, I should say, that went along with that. But what this does show is that back to this interactive relationships, there's a lot more to whether or not we have human health challenges due to soil conditions than just the level of something within a soil. And this goes both for human health benefits and for human health challenges. Um, there's more to it than the level of a heavy metal. Or we have a lot of soils out there that if you do the analysis, they have high levels of phosphorus or high levels of potassium, but that phosphorus or potassium is not in a plant accessible form, so the plants don't take that up and they're deficient in one of these nutrients. It's there, they can't get it. And so it's a much more complex problem than just the sheer amount that we see in the soil. We need to really understand, the environmental risk potential of these contaminants. And back to kind of building off of the Iti example, one of the things that we've done in over the last few decades in an attempt to understand whether or not a metal poses a problem is develop a number of indices that look at various aspects of metals and soils. We saw one earlier from Chase's work. We looked at zinc at the site. Um, that was a contamination factor map. And so you'll see right up here the contamination factor, the ratio of the content of given metals, background concentration, like I explained to you on the slide there, on the earlier slide. This particular map is showing the potential ecological risk index. And down here, so that's down here, the potential, I'm sorry, I got the wrong potential ecological risk index, this one right here. It takes potential contamination index numbers, adds them all together. And so if you have, in the case of this map here, there are 6 different metals that go into creating the numbers that generate that map. And you can see that across the entire site, while we have some metals that aren't really of concern across the map as a whole, we tend to be in the considerable or very high ecological risk zone because of the sum total of the metals. Now, what it ends up being in the case of this map, and you start digging into the data, we have some pretty high lead levels at this particular site, and the lead really dominates this particular, summed analysis. We have all the lead maps look pretty red, and because of that, the map looking at a view of multiple metals, those maps tend to look pretty bad also for this particular site. But this is an attempt to get at that, is the metal a problem or not? Something that's above and beyond just, oh, I've got, X milligrams per kilogram of a given metal, at the site. This is trying to get beyond that and say, okay, so is there really a problem, the metal at the site? A really good example of that, again, continuing on from with Chase's work, if you look at arsenic at Chase's site, at this brownfield site he's working at, and you look at the EPA guidelines, arsenic levels are through the roof. Every single sample we took at this site and analyzed comes out above the EPA recommended guidelines for arsenic in soil. And we took, there's 419 total samples at this site, taken at 130 different points and at 4 different depths. And if you take that, of course, you multiply 130 by 4, you don't get 419. But there were some sites we simply couldn't get samples from some of the deeper horizons. We had, it's a brown field. We ran into concrete, we ran into gravel, we ran into coal. There's all kinds of stuff out here at this site. But we got 419 samples. Every single sample was over the EPA guidelines for arsenic. If we map the arsenic contamination using these a couple of these different factors, Chase has looked at several indices. We'll just look at 2 as an example here. But here's the contamination factor again for arsenic. You do see that it shows problems at the site. We got a lot of red, we got a lot of of orange on there. That indicates we probably have arsenic contamination. But you also see some sites that are in the green, where contamination is not really viewed as much of an issue. This is where we're now comparing the arsenic levels that we saw to our natural expected background levels instead of just using a X milligrams of cadmium per kilogram of soil type of measurement. Um, with the EPA guidelines, that map is solid red. There is no variation. The contamination factor, still pretty contaminated, but we start to see some variation. The IGO values, this is similar to the contamination factor in that it uses the numbers that we got from our analysis and the expected background levels, but it looks at them, the calculation runs a bit differently. Now, with the IGO and looking at arsenic, we see that most of the site falls into the green, which for IGO indicates unpolluted to moderately polluted. And we have a few limited sites that show as being strongly to extremely polluted at the site. Exact same numbers in terms of arsenic analysis, three different ways of looking at it, three rather different resulting conclusions, if you will. We really, really need to work on how we can definitively indicate that a given contaminant is causing a problem. A human health risk, an environmental health risk at a given site. Because we have these indices, we have these different ways of looking at things. The different ways can give us different conclusions. If you happen to look at that map, by the way, do notice that the patterns are very, very similar on both maps. It's just the conclusion you get from the patterns that is different. So this is something that we need to work on. Understanding emerging contaminants, and emerging contaminants are those. Emerging does not mean they've just shown up. We've had PFAS. We've been using PFAS chemicals for decades. Plastics, we've been using them for decades. Pharmaceuticals, right? I mean, everything on this list we've been using for decades. Something is an emerging contaminant, however, if it is not currently regulated or has only very recently become regulated. And we have a lot of things out there that we know cause human health problems that are not regulated or have only very recently been regulated. So the regulations aren't maybe really well established. Dealing with these, and right now, like PFAS is getting a huge amount of attention right now. Microplastics are getting a huge amount of attention. Pharmaceuticals, personal care products, e-wastes, they started getting a lot of attention 10, 15, 20 years ago. But a number of them still are not regulated in the environment. So these are things that we really need to understand what they're doing, how they cause problems, what problems they cause, what we can do about them. But they're still major human health challenges. And then new statistical tools to investigate these soil human health links. When we take the traditional scientific approach, we isolate a variable, we see how the changing that isolated variable, how that alters the system. This just doesn't really work well in something that's as integrated and complex as the way that the environment around us influences our health. And again, we can go back and look at that itty itty example. That's a great, that's one great example of where things kind of start to fall apart with that traditional isolated variable approach. If you simply isolate cadmium and then look at Japan, you'll decide that 1 to 3 milligrams of cadmium per kilogram of soil causes health problems. Then you go to ship from England, that entire conclusion falls apart. So we need to do things that allow us to more accurately, more completely, look at the system level on this. Epidemiology has some approaches that are promising. for this. Just some examples of approaches that epidemiology uses in their analysis of human health issues include causal diagrams. The causal diagram basically lays out all the relationships, and then it is more complex than what you see on the screen here. It's not just a flow chart. There are some numbers behind it, all of this as well. But you start off with a chart that seeks to map out all the relationships, and then you work your way through those relationships um, with the statistical approaches. Marginal structural models are a subset of causal diagrams, so they do this. But when you use a marginal structural model, you include both an exposed population and an unexposed population within your overall analysis. The unexposed population seeking to establish a baseline for health outcomes in the given situation. But we see the 2.8%, the 1.0% of epidemiology there. I did some work a few years ago, published a paper on this, and where I was looking at, you know, the per, I looked at the percent of epidemiology papers that would use these approaches and the percent of soil science papers that have used these approaches. And so basically what it means here is that compared to epidemiology, only about 3% and 1% of soils investigations are applying these same types of techniques. What it's showing is that very, very few soil scientists are using these approaches to try to address the soil system, and yet the soil system is a very complex, interconnected system, just as the world the epidemiologists investigate is a very complex, very integrated system. So the epidemiologists make wide use of this. The world of soil, we're not making such good use of these opportunities. Another one, propensity score methods. Um, I won't spend a lot of time explaining it. I see I'm kind of probably running out of time here, but the 0.2% that tells you that almost nobody in soil science is using propensity score methods. And then machine learning, and you might think soil science is, machine learning is a big new thing in soil science. And in a sense it is. We are seeing more and more people using machine learning. When you compare us to epidemiologists, we are not using machine learning very much. So there are some options out there in the statistical world. They already exist. We don't have to invent them, but we're not using them. And they work for epidemiology. Like everything, they have their strengths and their weaknesses, but um, they work differently than the statistics that we're used to running, and are probably more suited to this soil human health approach and analysis than many of the things that we are doing from traditional soil science. Um, Finally, this is a very complex interdisciplinary issue. It's not going to be solved by any one field. There are lots of different disciplines that need to contribute if we're really going to understand soils and human health. Soil is a part of it, so obviously soil scientists are in there. But we've got our, agronomists slash crop scientists, our biologists, anthropologists, medical doctors, public health officials, sociologists. There's a lot of different components to what goes on in the soil and human health realm, and there is a lot of opportunity for some rather broad engagement. At the beginning of this, I started with a question, asked you to think to yourself, when you think about human health, what are the first, 3 or 4 things that come to mind? Is soil amongst them? I don't have a good answer for whether or not that's the case, with society at large. I'd love to collaborate with sociologists someday and do a study on the public and their, perspective of soils and human health, and if it's even on their radar. Um, but these are opportunities that are out there, whether for me or for others that have an interest in this topic to get engaged. A lot of times, some of these fields that you see on this list are very natural. They combinations. They do a lot of things together. Soil scientists working with geologists, geographers, agronomists, crop scientists. That's not an unusual occurrence, right? That happens all the time. But for those in the room here, when's the last time you collaborated with a medical doctor? Um, I've asked this question before at conferences where we're there face to face, and sometimes one or two hands in the room will go up. It's never very many. If I'm at a soils or agronomy type conference, it's not a lot of hands if it's any. I do have a couple of papers out there with an MD. I've done a little bit of it, not nearly as much as probably I would like to. And then, of course, appropriate funding pathways are a big question for this topic as well. You got someone working on soils, working on human health. Where does soil scientists go to get funding, and where do human health professionals go to get funding? And this not really the same answer. Um, so, having appropriate funding pathways to push this forward. There are some places and you can kind of, work your foot into a crack in the door, but there's not a lot of mainline funding to address this particular topic. So with that, that's what I have for you today. My prepared presentation remarks. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Eric. We will be going into our question time. So if folks would like to put their questions into the chat, please don't forget to take the demographic poll that just popped up on your screen. It helps us keep track of you all and how these presentations go. So I'll kick things off here. Bob, you mentioned differences in redox, Bob Guthrie, earlier in Eric's presentation. I wonder do you want to expand on the question you had, or if there was anything else to that?
Yeah, just with that, I mean, with I believe cadmium, yeah, will kind of bind with, like, for instance, sulfur. And so depending on the oxidation state, of that, and it's really kind of running like a chemical speciation model. But then, you get organic complexes, and I mean, it can get pretty involved. But
It can get very complex, yes.
yeah.
Great. Wanda said you mentioned medical doctors. What about veterinarians, One Health? Eric, have you heard of more studies or any studies where veterinarians and soil scientists are collaborating?
Yeah, again, I'd say it's probably similar to soil scientists and medical doctors. There are some instances where that's happened. I was involved in a soils and human health um, session at the Tri Societies several years ago that did have a veterinarian that presented at. So it's not unheard of, but it's also, I wouldn't say it's not like it's a super common relationship that we've seen either. The soils through animals to humans connection, it's recognized, but I think a lot of that falls very much into those antecedal connections that Margaret Oliver noted in her 1997 review article. There's not been a lot of at least what I've seen of controlled experimental scientific approach to that. And it's more of a, well, the animals are better fed and the animals, get, and we do have, so there's plenty of animal nutrition studies and showing that animals get, healthier animals get better milk or better meat or, quality of these things. I mean, those are out there, but a lot of the taking it from that point, going from soil to animal to human health, making that complete connection is a lot of that is more antecedent. No, we know this. We know that this over here, these studies show, better quality products, better health in people. These studies over here show, soil, better forage, better animal production, better animal products. But it's closing the loop.
Mm.
It's not so often done from a scientific perspective.
Yeah, that was actually going to be my question is, what do you think we need more of when it comes to those claims or One Health desires to close the loop?
Mm-hmm.
Um, what would a controlled One Health research question or project look like in order for us to better answer or address that question?
Yeah, and that's a really good question. And that's where things like the propensity score models come in,
Mm,
statistically speaking. Obviously it would be unethical to set up an experiment where you expect some people to get health benefits and you expect others to either not get benefits or even suffer from that kind of from the treatment that you're going to put them under, right? I mean, like with crops, all the time we'll go out and do a plot experiment and we'll over fertilize them, we'll under fertilize them, you know we can see that where the prime spot is because you kind of stress, if you will, the plants on each side. We can't do that to people in a controlled experiment. And the propensity score techniques are something epidemiologists have arrived at, where they can go out and the propensity scoring allows for basically corrections, if you will, or modifications made to the statistics that are run that account for variables that should influence the outcomes but are not collected as a part of a controlled experiment. But it allows them to look at epidemiologists work all the time with environmental exposure and trying to tease out um, where the which exposures are actually causing problems and what are the interrelationships between those exposures. That's where designing studies that we can use information that's already there and we can run it through some of these statistical models that epidemiologists use is where we can start to close that loop.
mm, great. So back to the questions in the chat here. We had Amelia ask, is anyone looking at the impact of biosolids used in agriculture, especially as it relates to human health?
Um, Definitely yes. Again, sometimes indirectly. But with various biosolids, there can be transmission. If biosolids are not handled appropriately, there can be transmission of pathogenic organisms that go with the biosolids. We can introduce things we don't want, heavy metals, for example, into a soil with biosolids. By the way, don't get the idea that I'm anti-biosolids. We have a manure study going right now out at our farms, and we can see a lot of benefits from it. But biosolids have to be handled appropriately. We can get a lot of our animals in today's world. We do a lot of antibiotics and other pharmaceuticals in the raising of those animals, and so if the biosolids aren't appropriately managed, then all these are things you can end up transferring into the soil with the biosolids. Composting is one thing that can take care of several of these issues. We can't compost heavy metals out, but we can appropriate composting will destroy pathogens. Uh, at least some of the pharmaceuticals will break down chemically with appropriate composting. So there are studies that do look at that. Some of the really ones that come most immediately to mind for me would include things like adding manures to a soil and then tracking whether or not the addition of that manure is leading to an increase in antibiotic resistance amongst the organisms within that soil system. That's one a good example. And then, of course, if you are building antibiotic resistance in the natural system, if you're eating foods off of those, the concern is that resistance being transferred through the system and negatively ultimately affecting human health. So again, there's not a completely closed loop, but it's a look at one aspect of where that might impact human health, and are our activities leading to positive or negative results as regards to that aspect.
Yeah, great. And then I'll just ask one more question from the chat before we go into our breakout rooms. Brian asked, is there any long-term solar farm soils being tested when we think about human health, especially with those heavy
Yeah,
metals or other things we should be concerned about?
that's a really good question. I just got involved with agrivoltaics in any way, shape, or form in the last about year and a half, maybe. Um, and I haven't really looked at it yet from a soil and human health perspective, looking out there to see what people have done. Agrivoltaics, I will say that Europe is a good deal ahead of us on agrivoltaics. A lot of the agrivoltaics in the US have revolved around livestock, especially sheep. So grazing within the solar panels. A lot of success there because sheep can take good advantage of the forage. The sheep farmer, of course, gets something of value from letting a sheep, letting their sheep graze amongst those solar panels. And sheep tend to cause less damage than mechanical mowing in a solar field. Mowers that throw stones are not very welcomed amongst solar panels. That's become a bigger problem than initially anticipated when solar fields were first really put in a big scale here in the U.S. So the sheep have been a good counter to that. What we're trying to do here, and what Chase is characterizing soils for here, we have Southern Illinois is a large has a pretty large horticultural crops, fruits in particular, industry going, and so we'd be looking at trying to grow things like dwarf apples, dwarf peaches, grapes underneath solar panels, um, and so that's our approach. Um, but people looking at the someone's probably done it, but I haven't gone looking for any studies. People looking at like quality of the food coming from under the panels as compared to without the panels and what that human health link may be. Um, our concerns have been more on this site, not wanting to put food producing plants into a place where the soils are already going to knowingly cause a problem for us. That's been more of our concerns on this site.
Yeah. Well, more research to do keeps us all
Yep.
busy, right?
If you're doing it right, you never run out of questions, right?
There
Yeah.
you, there you go. All right. So it's looking like we might not have time for breakouts, folks. And I just wanted to give a last reminder of our next talk, which will be Michael Langenmeyer from Purdue talking about trade-offs between conservation and profitability. You may or may not have seen his recent summary on cover crop use and finances. It's very interesting. So I would recommend you check it out. And he will be going through that work during that presentation next month.
And if I could break in really quick, I did
Oh,
notice
absolutely.
someone put in the chat right as you were talking a question about things like PFAS and microplastics in biosolids, and yes, those can be a concern also in biosolids.
Great. All right. That's all we have, folks. If Eric, you want to put your information on the screen again, folks, if you have more
Okay,
questions or
just doing
interests when it comes to this topic, please reach out. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
it. Have a great day, everybody.